Thank you for joining me. I'm doing a little different setup today just because I'm lazy and didn't feel like moving back into my office after my heated Ms. Monopoly victory yesterday. So let me know if there's any audio or video issues. For some reason, it's not leaving me chat to my YouTube audience. So if you're on YouTube, I can see your comments, but for some reason my comments aren't showing up there. So what's up, Modus? What's up, the rest of you on YouTube? What's up, Avedon? Those of you on DLive. So thanks everyone so much for joining. As always, this past couple weeks, we'll be talking about the only story that matters at this point, which is the shutdown as a result of this pandemic and things like that. Now, just a quick rehash. Remember, my take from the get-go on this has been that we should have just demanded answers to basic questions before we basically gave the government a blank check to do whatever they want, shut down the economy, etc. So those questions I wanted answered were, what is the magnitude? How many people could be infected? How many people could die? What was the probability that that would occur? What is the threshold that the government was using for, hey, we think if things get this bad, it justifies these sorts of taking away your rights and spending of this money, etc. And finally, what was the cost-benefit analysis of the solution? So by shutting down the government, by spending $6 trillion, how do they think that could save people? How many people could that save? And what are the costs of that? That's it. These aren't difficult questions to answer. Any plan that you have for anything would default have these answers. My plan is to go buy more milk. The magnitude is my entire family could be affected if we run out of milk. The probability is, yeah, there's a decent chance. The threshold is when I see the milk get down to this low, I go buy milk. The solution is it'll cost $4 or whatever, but it'll save the people from running out of milk. I mean, it's a stupid example, but you see what I mean. Every time that we enact some sort of plan in our life or in the government, all of these questions are inherently in there. So you should be able to, as American citizens, demand before your money, your economy, your rights be infringed upon, that these simple questions be answered. That's all I was saying. I was told, yeah, Feminazi Monopoly was cool. By the way, for those of you that missed my video yesterday, nothing to do with politics, I played Feminist Monopoly with my wife and her sister, and I won! Despite the rules being geared against men, such as you only get $200 for pass and go if you're a man, you get $240 if you're a woman, etc. So, win one for the good guys there. Anyways, the government didn't answer those questions, and I said, well, then what you'll see happen as a result is they'll exploit this crisis like they always do, and they will claim that they were correct to do so because they never gave these numbers initially. And so then when we see the end result, no matter if it's 5 million people die or 1,000 people die, they'll say, yep, that proves we were correct in doing our actions. If it's few deaths, they'll say, see, we did the right thing. If it's many deaths, they'll say, see, we were right to infringe on your rights. Just like with the Patriot Act. And my biggest fear is, even more than a fear of this disease, even more than a fear of the economy being collapsed, which, by the way, the economic fears are far more realistic than the disease fears. But the number one fear for me is this country will be destroyed because we are setting the precedent that anytime the government says, here's a threat, we don't know how bad the threat could be, that people will not only accept the government having a blank check and doing whatever they want to fight this threat, but they'll demand it. And they'll criticize people like me that say, whoa, hold back a little. Let's have some basic questions answered beforehand. I was told that I was a fool for suggesting that. Millions of people would die if we had to take the time to answer these questions. And this disease is of such a big magnitude that we should just let the government do whatever they want. I said, okay, that's a mistake. You're going to see, for example, this be used in the future to push the Green New Deal. That's exactly what we saw the Democrats do in Pelosi's bill. I said, you're going to see all sorts of wealth redistribution go to billionaires and go to other groups that don't deserve it. That's exactly what we see in the Republican-passed bill, where art centers are getting $25 million, Congress people are getting potential raises of $25 million, places like PBS are getting millions of dollars, etc. That's exactly what happened. But still, I'm told, but the disease is so massive. It's so massive that we have to accept these things. Look, let me make it clear again. When I criticize Trump, I'm not just criticizing Trump. Make no mistake about it. The Democratic governors are the ones that started these sorts of lockdowns. But Trump was on board with shutting down huge sectors of the economy. And Trump worked, in his own words, with these same Democratic governors like Cuomo and Newsom in California, Gavin Newsom in California, and said that their lockdowns and their policies were good. So this isn't just a Democrat thing. It's the Republicans were also instrumental in passing this bill. Trump's team was on board. I'm not being partisan here. It's the whole darn government. They're exploiting a crisis again. So what I wanted to talk about today was the numbers. Right? Now, I've been talking about the numbers. I've been showing you evidence, for example, that the CDC says from October 1st to March 14th of this year, as many as 59,000 people in the United States have died of the flu. The regular old flu. 59,000 people up till March 14th. That's the most recent numbers they have. Of the flu. Do you see why that threshold question is important? What was the government thinking? How many people may have died of coronavirus? 50,000? Well, then why do we have these sorts of actions with coronavirus when we don't with the common everyday flu? Or with the H1N1 flu? Or with tuberculosis? Or with West Nile virus? Or with SARS? You see what I'm getting at? Not only does this show that in the past, the reactions were different, but it sets the precedent for, okay, next year the flu, if someone could credibly argue the flu may kill 50,000 people, which it probably will because it does every year on average, then they'll say, hey, we have to shut the country down. That's why it's so dangerous to adopt these sorts of mindsets. But I was still told, oh, okay, but just because the flu currently has killed more people doesn't mean that the coronavirus won't in the future. And so I've been asking people like, well, give me your number. If the government didn't give us the numbers, then how are we supposed to? The government never once said, this is our model for how many people will die. Trump said about 5 days ago in his press conference, it was the first time they've suggested numbers. He said as many as 50,000 people could die. 50,000. That's less than died of the flu. That's the only time Trump's given a number. I talked to a journalist from Williamsport named Todd Bartley. It was a video I did, not the Monopoly video, but the one before it. It's an amazing video. Todd Bartley's the only journalist I know in this country asking executives, in this case the executives are the governor of Pennsylvania and his team, these sorts of questions about things like threshold. The only journalist I know of. And they won't give him a response. They just said, well, the threshold's been passed. But what is the threshold? How many people did the PA governor's team think would be infected? How many did they think would die if they didn't take these actions? And how many do they think could be saved by taking these actions? They won't answer. And so one of the side effects of that is no matter what happens, our governor, Tom Wolf, will say, yes, I was right. If not one more person dies of the coronavirus, he'll say, yes, I was right. My policy saved lives. If 100,000 die in Pennsylvania, he'll say, yes, I was right. The fact so many people died proved that I was right to do what I did. And so it's non-falsifiable. And so the next time an emergency comes up, Governor Wolf will say, hey, I was right last time. So you got to just trust me this time when I massively redistribute wealth, shut down the economy, and take away your rights. Every single time, they'll say, we were right last time, just like with the Patriot Act. We were right to pass the Patriot Act. It solved terrorism. How? What's your proof? Well, we don't have to give you proof. So I want to take a look at the numbers that people have been talking about. Now, remember, I was told, remember quite clearly, this is important. What I said was, I'm not saying the government could never take these sorts of actions. I'm just saying it has to be in catastrophic events, and they have to, anytime they're going to infringe on our rights in this way, they should meticulously be forced to explain exactly why they're doing it. So, for example, we could see, to me, an example of when the government should interfere. If there's a virus that's going to kill 50% of the country reasonably, that would be a time. If you see Ebola sweeping through town after town after town, killing people, that would be a time to say, look, the government should act. You know, there could be other emergencies, like if a hurricane's about to hit and you can see it wiped out, you know, the areas before it came to you. So your local government's like, look, you got to evacuate. Things like that. I get it. I'm not such a libertarian that I'm saying the government should never be allowed to act in this way. All I'm saying is I'm going to follow the lesson of our founding fathers and say, anytime the government wants an infringement on our rights, it is incumbent on the government to meticulously explain exactly why they're taking those rights away and exactly how taking those rights away from us is necessary to solve the problem. And instead, I've been mocked and told, no, you can't do that. And not just by left-wing people, but by right-wing people, by Trump supporters. We just have to believe it. We have to believe the same government that lied to us over and over and over. The same government that spied on Trump's campaign, The same media that said, oh, no, they didn't. Russia, the Russia hoax. The same media and intel agencies that said 12 Russian trolls on Facebook stole the election. The same ones that said to even question the FBI would damage our country. All of that. We just have to believe them without question. That's what these people told me. On the right and the left. Okay, so that lays the groundwork for what I want to talk to about today. So the idea was, despite everything that I've said, the numbers are going to be so bad that I'm wrong. That's what I was told. So what we're going to do is go through some of the numbers that we're seeing around the world and in the United States. Some of the doctors that are instrumental in creating these policies. And see what they have to say. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of it. It's Friday. I'm going to try to enjoy myself a little today. But I was having these discussions that I thought were worthwhile. So there was a doctor and a group out of Imperial College, which I believe's in the UK. And their numbers were being bandied around by media outlets everywhere, saying as many as 40 million people globally could die, as many as 500,000 British people could die, as many as 2.2 million people in America could die. And these were all coming from this study. And I was told, these are doctors. You're not a doctor, so shut your mouth. We have to trust the doctors. And so these were the catastrophic numbers that we were dealing with. Now, the governments neither in the UK or in the US said, yes, these are the numbers we're following. But one of the problems is when the government doesn't speak up and say, this is what our model is, that allows any fearmonger to come in and say, oh, well, here's what the real model is. And it scares the crap out of people. Because now they're hearing, what, 2.2 million dead in the United States? Oh, my God. Maybe that's not the numbers the government. Maybe it is the numbers the government was using. Maybe it's not. But because the government didn't tell us, there's this vacuum. And it's going to be filled with the biggest fearmongers. That's what's going to happen. That's why you see morons buying crates of toilet paper, which have nothing to do with this virus. Because the fearmongering. So, I wanted to bring up, this gentleman's name was Dr. Ferguson. So I want to show you an article. It's not that. This is from yesterday. Imperial College scientists who predicted 500,000 coronavirus deaths in the UK adjust it to 20,000 or fewer. Now I want you to think about this for a minute. This guy predicted 500,000 people would die. Now he's changed that prediction, and not just him, the entire study. They've changed that prediction to 20,000. That is a 96% reduction in the amount of deaths. In other words, 20,000 people dying, 500,000 people dying is 25 times more deaths than what they're now predicting. So they've changed their minds in a matter of a week. Now, the media and all these people said 500,000, 500,000. Oh, that's the number they used to justify this. Whoops, turns out that was inflated by 25 times. Or the real number is 96% less that they're now predicting. 20,000 deaths, look, that's terrible, right? But that's hardly 500,000. And does that justify locking down the entire country of the UK? I don't think so. When the flu kills about that a year in the UK. Let's see what it says. A scientist who warned that the coronavirus would kill 500,000 people in the United Kingdom has presented evidence that if current measures work as expected, then the death toll would drop to roughly 20,000 people or fewer. Scientist and Imperial College author Neil Ferguson said Wednesday the coronavirus death toll is unlikely to exceed 20,000 and could be much lower if lockdown measures continue, according to New Scientist. He added that he is reasonably confident that Britain's health system can handle the burden of treating coronavirus patients. There'll be some areas that are extremely stressed, but we are reasonably confident, which is all we could be at the current time, that at the national level we'll be within capacity. The Imperial College has previously warned of modeling that suggested over 500,000 people would die. This is a remarkable turn from Neil Ferguson, who led the Imperial College authors who warned of 500,000 UK deaths, who has now himself tested positive for COVID, former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson wrote on Twitter. Ferguson credited the UK's lockdown for stopping the spread of the virus. But as Berenson points out, the country only began its lockdown 2 days ago. And the theory it is that lockdowns take 2 weeks or more to work. New data shows that the transmission rate of the virus, the measure of how many people a carrier usually infects, is up from 2.5 to just over 3, Ferguson said. That adds more evidence to support that more intensive social distancing measures. Fox News host Laura Ingraham said on Twitter following the revised projections, "Now that we are seeing the ICU bed and vent projections from original Imperial College study are almost certainly wrong, it is critical that we think immediately about staggered gradual opening of our country with new protocols. The guy behind the doomsday Imperial College model now says he expects UK not to run out of ICU beds and UK deaths unlikely to pass 20,000 and it could be much lower." Stanford scientists recently wrote an opinion article suggesting that more information is needed before settling on a coronavirus mortality rate and posited that mass quarantines aren't necessarily the most logical answer to combat the virus. Almost 500,000 corona cases have been confirmed across the globe. 22,000 people have died, while 120,000 have recovered. Isn't that odd? Did you catch that part about the Stanford scientists saying a quarantine isn't the best way to solve things? Did you catch that? Now, I was told I'm just a layman. I have to accept the quarantines. I have to accept the government shutdown, shutting down huge portions of our economy. I have to accept $6 trillion in the United States to fight it because I'm not a scientist. Well, it's okay. There's scientists that disagree. Why are their numbers wrong? The guy that you believed, the numbers that you believed, not you, my audience, but that the people screaming doomsday believed, that guy's now saying, oops, sorry, my number was 25 times higher than it should have been. Now, full disclosure, Dr. Ferguson has came out and said he's still predicting 500,000 people would die if the UK did not take these measures. So let me be as honest as possible to Dr. Ferguson. But that's not going to make sense. For example, every doctor that I've heard quoted in the United States said, see, it's not that we could really stop this virus from spreading. What we could do is flatten the curve. In other words, because of the long incubation periods, the fact that the disease it can still live on certain surfaces, that it's as infectious as it is, it means that basically we're not able to completely stop the infection from spreading. What we could do is ensure that that spread occurs over a longer time. And if it occurs over a longer time, that means less people will be in the hospital at one time. This doesn't affect the mortality rate. This doesn't affect the infectious rate. What it does is it says, if we have a situation where everybody gets infected at the same time, then more people will die because we can't properly treat it because we don't have the facilities to be able to do so. But that's not the disease will become deadlier because a change in the formation of the disease. It's just we won't be able to treat it properly. Okay, maybe I could believe that argument. But there's no way that the spreading out, what that would mean then would be that 96% less deaths from 500,000 to 20,000 in the UK. That this gentleman saying the difference in that, which is what? 480,000. 96% of deaths from the coronavirus, this guy is saying, is based on we won't have ICU beds. That is insane. There is no evidence to suggest that whatsoever. Now keep in mind, this person's saying the government's reaction will lead to a 96% reduction in deaths. That could be possible if that would include the government formulating some sort of cure. But that's not what Dr. Ferguson is saying. He's saying the mere practice of social distancing will stop 96% of the deaths of this disease in the UK and around the world. That's insanity. That's absolute garbage. Now, what does this mean? Well, what did I tell you from the get-go? Because we did not force the government to give answers to those 4 questions, how many people will get infected and die? What's the probability of that? What's your threshold for when we should shut down the government and spend trillions, the actions that we've seen? And 4th, what are your estimates for how many lives those sorts of actions will save? Because we did not force the government to answer these questions, that's going to allow people like Dr. Ferguson for the rest of his life to make doomsday predictions and then say, hey, if you just give the government all your rights, you'll totally be saved. It's not that Dr. Ferguson's saying, if the UK government doesn't lock down, 500,000 people will die. If they do lock down, then only 100,000 would die. So we could have 5 times less deaths if the government locks down. He's saying 25 times less deaths. That defies belief. That's unbelievable, quite literally. Unbelievable. And that lets you know his original projection was garbage. Because here's what's going to happen. All of these doomsayers that were saying 2.2 million dead in the United States, millions dead in the United States, and I'm just focusing on the United States right now. When the final tally comes out and it's something like 40, 50,000, if that, and then people like me are like, oh, so was it worth it to crash the economy when only 40, 50,000 people died? Less than die of the flu every year? They'll say, oh, but hundreds of millions would have died if we didn't crash the economy. And we'll have no way to disprove them at all. None. This is exactly like the Patriot Act. Exactly. Hey, you got to trust us. You got to give away your Fourth Amendment rights. Leave us look into all your phone calls and your emails. If you do, we promise we'll keep you safe from terrorists. See, it worked. Just give us all of your rights and we'll assure, if you don't give us your rights, then millions upon millions of people will die. But if you do give us our rights, then only 1,000 people will die. And we're going to believe that crap? And not just look, you expect people that believe in big government to say, yes, big government's the solution. We should all be scared out of our minds and give power to big government. But what blows my mind is how many small government people are saying this. Trump supporters or Republicans. Remember that $2 trillion aid package that gives $25 million to the Kennedy Art Center and millions to PBS and $25 million to help refugees and immigrants from the disease and things like that. All that garbage. It's a slap in the face to you, by the way, as they're telling you, the average American, you have to sacrifice. People could die if we don't have social distancing, if you don't go to your job, if the economy doesn't collapse. It's time for you as a regular American to pull up your bootstraps and do everything you can to fight this virus. As they're telling you that, the very second that they were telling you that, they're in backroom deals discussing how can we take more of the American monies to give it to pet projects that have nothing to do with the fight with this virus. Both sides of the aisle were doing that. Both. And it's going to be signed off by the president. 96-0, it passed in the Senate. So don't tell me it's only one side. Garbage. And I see all these small government fiscal conservatives. Yes, $6 trillion. That might not be enough. Just give the government a blank check. You're a horrible person, Rob. How dare you criticize this? Millions will die. Really? The doctor that said millions will die is now saying, oh, and if we just social distance, then only 20,000 will die. I mean, it's nonsense. And everybody knows it. So, I thought to myself, what is the best, because we'll never be able to fully test this. I mean, do you understand what non-falsifiable means? It means we can, because of the conditions they've set up, we could never disprove their claim, ever. Well, let me give you an example, right? Hey, an asteroid's going to hit Earth, so if you don't give me $1 billion, we're all dead. If you give me $1 billion, I'll do something magical to make sure the asteroid doesn't hit and kill us all. So then the government says, okay, Rob, here's $1 billion. And I say, see, the asteroid didn't hit. That proves I was right. But wait a minute. That's non-falsifiable. It could have been the asteroid was never going to hit in the first place. Well, better give me $1 billion just to be safe. So next year, I'll say, hey, another asteroid. Hey, Rob saved us last time. The proof that Rob's right is that we didn't all die last time. Let's give him our money again. Hi, all. Thanks for being here. So, the best I could come up with, right, is what is the most analogous situation to the coronavirus? And the best I could come up with that we have significant data on is the flu. Okay? The flu, like the coronavirus, we're told it's less infectious, but let's just say arguably it's equally as infectious. The incubation period's shorter, but we'll just say all of that is reasons that the coronavirus would be worse than the flu. So, for the sake of this argument, I'm going to assume that the coronavirus and the flu's numbers in that area would be similar, but that's not going to disprove. That doesn't allow people that want to cheer for the government to say, oh, well, you've been disproven because it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. You're right. It's an apples-to-watermelons comparison. right? The watermelon's a much bigger thing. The coronavirus, they're telling us, is a much bigger thing. So if I could look at even a smaller thing and prove that the numbers of the bigger thing aren't justified, it's hard to explain, but you'll see what I'm saying. I do see Periscope comments, so thank you. What I'm proposing we do is look at the numbers with the flu from the time that the government's actions in shutting down and their social distancing policy started, and to see if the numbers of the flu have extremely declined by 96%, as Dr. Ferguson is suggesting social distance policies would do. Now, if the coronavirus is even more infectious, as we're told, than the flu, if we could limit the coronavirus by 96% by social distancing, that would mean that a less infectious disease like the flu would be limited even more than 96%. So what I'm proposing we do is look at official government numbers of the flu and seeing, since the time of social distancing, are we seeing things like a 96% reduction in the flu? Because what they're saying is, well, we don't know enough about the coronavirus. So we can't look and say, has social distancing limited the coronavirus's infectious spread by 96%? Or, and let me be fully honest, it wouldn't have to be exactly 96%. That's just the amount of lives that would be saved. But a lot of those deaths they're claiming would be because the peak would mean we would run out of ICU beds and things like that. Nonetheless, for that to be true, for the social distancing to save 96% of lives, we would need to see that it significantly, by a large percentage, hampered the spread of the disease. And because we have no idea what a normal coronavirus season would look like, it's impossible to do that. But we do know what a normal flu season would look like, and we do know that these same social distancing policies would stop the spread of the flu in the same way. So, let's look at the weekly flu numbers from the CDC and see if we see a significant drop-off in the cases of the flu compared year to year. Now, I warn you, these numbers were extremely difficult to find as far as comparing them year to year. So I don't have that exactly, but I'll show you what I have. So this is the weekly influenza report from the CDC. That's the agency that's leading the charge against this virus in the United States, the Center for Disease Control, right? Now, it says first, notes, COVID-19 outbreak unfolding in the United States may affect healthcare-seeking behavior, which would in turn impact data. And they go on to further explain this. What they're saying is this. All of the numbers I'm going to show you are for the common flu. But what they're suggesting here is, look, there's probably going to be less hospitalizations for the flu than there normally would have been because people that just have the flu aren't going to the hospital to get diagnosed because they're afraid that they'll get coronavirus. Key updates for week 11, ending March 14th, 2020. So this is well after the shutdown started. This is the most recent week we have. Quote, laboratory-confirmed flu activity as reported by clinical laboratories continued to decrease. However, influenza-like illness activity increased. Influenza severity indicators remain moderate to low overall, but hospitalization rates differ by age group with high rates among children and young adults. Wait a minute. How can that be? If social distancing would have a 96% reductions in the death of coronavirus, wouldn't we expect to see the cases of influenza dropping? But no. Now, you might say, yes, but that's because they dropped more than they would have in a regular year. But that's not true either. As I go on to read, they basically say this is commonplace. The numbers we're seeing are about what you expect to see every year for the flu at this time in the month. How can that be? Key points. Nationally, the percent of specimens testing positive for influenza at clinical laboratories continue to decrease while ILI activity increased for the second week in a row after declining for 3 weeks. During the COVID pandemic, more people may be seeking care for respiratory illness than usual at this time. Nationally, influenza viruses are now most commonly reported influenza virus this season. Previously, it was the B variant. Laboratory-confirmed influenza-associated hospitalization rates for the U.S. population overall remain moderate compared to the recent seasons. But rates for children 0 to 4 and adults 18 to 49 are now the highest the CDC has on record for those age groups, surpassing rates reported during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. Hospitalization rates for school-age children are higher than any recent regular season, but remain lower than rates experienced by this age group during the pandemic. Let me repeat that. Laboratory-confirmed influenza-associated hospitalization rates for the U.S. population overall remain moderate compared to recent seasons, but rates for children 0 to 4 and adults 18 to 49 are now the highest the CDC has on record for these age groups. Wait a minute, so you mean to tell me that despite the social distancing policies that will have a 96% effect on the death rate for coronavirus, that the flu is experiencing the highest rates in these age groups? How does that make sense whatsoever? Wouldn't we see a sharp decline immediately in the spread of the flu if these social distancing policies were so effective? Now again, what people will say, and I'm playing devil's advocate, they'll say, oh yes, but here's what Dr. Ferguson is saying. By stopping, see, the coronavirus started incubation periods at different times. So by instituting the social distancing policies 2 days before Dr. Ferguson changed his prediction, that actually allows for the 96% reduction in death rate that we'll be hearing about. But that's not true at all, because one of the things we're learning is far more people were infected than previously thought. Over 90% of the people worldwide that are infected with the coronavirus aren't showing, quote, serious signs of illness, many of which are asymptomatic or have such few symptoms they didn't even bother to go get tested. We have no idea what that number is, but there are literally thousands upon thousands of people in the UK and the United States, and it could be up to hundreds of thousands or millions that have had the virus, and it ran its course, and they didn't go to the doctor, and that was that. So if that's the case, as Dr. Ferguson admits, that we have no idea how many people are infected, then how can they say just starting these policies of social distancing 2 days ago would have a 96% reduction in the death rate? The only way numbers like that would make sense is if you have social isolation before the disease starts to spread. You can't wait until it's been spreading for 2 months and then say, okay, now we have social distancing and it will solve 96% of the deaths. It might solve 20% of the deaths, maybe even 40 or 50, but there is no humanly possible way that it's going to solve 96% of the deaths when it's already been spreading for 2 months. That proves one of two things. Either he's wrong in suggesting the total deaths will only be 20,000, or what I believe, his estimate, his prediction that 500,000 people would die in the UK was ridiculous. Dan says more people die from crashes, smoking, and obesity than this virus. Yeah, more people die of the flu than this virus. Here's the problem, Dan, right? I've gone through this with people ad nauseum for the past week when I say, what about car deaths? What about suicide? What about opioids, right? What about diabetes? They'll say, oh, none of that matters. None of it's infectious disease. We're only talking about infectious disease. That's the only thing we're talking about here. So what you want to do is reduce the argument to the most simplistic form. So anytime you could say car deaths and they say, no, that's different because XYZ. Gun deaths. No, that's different because XYZ. Flu. Both infectious diseases, both could be spread even if you're taking every precaution necessary. 50,000 people a year die of the flu in the United States. That's why the threshold number is so important. Ask people. They won't answer you. Ask them, the ones that are cheering for this. They'll say, they speak in platitudes that are garbage. You can't put a price on human life. Okay, so does that mean that we have to shut down the country anytime it could save one life? Well, no. Okay, then apparently you can put a price on human life. So then the question is this price acceptable? Why can't they just, why won't anyone get, I asked people on this website above Top Secret I'm on. I said, just give me the number. Let's take a number. 50,000 people. Let's say if the government wouldn't have taken these actions, 50,000 people would die. Is it worth the government taking these actions? You can say yes. I disagree with you, but you can say yes. At least I respect that you're being honest. Do you know that not one person that mocked me for questioning the government, not one out of dozens, not one person was willing to answer that question? Not one. It was just platitudes. You can't put a value on human life. Just platitudes. That was it. I said, just 50,000 people. Or give me your number. Maybe you'd say, no, not 50,000, but 100,000. Fair enough. We could have an honest discussion then. We could decide whether or not we'll talk about rights and economic interests versus, protecting us. The trade-off of liberty for safety. We could have those conversations. And reasonable people, by the way, could disagree. That's fine. But don't mock me and tell me I'm wrong for asking questions, and then at the same time refuse to take a stance. Oh, I'm not going to give you a number. I'm not going to give you a threshold. All I'm saying is this time the government's right. Okay, that's next time they'll say the same thing. Again, here's the analogy I'm using. There's a reason that we have laws. A law, what it really is, if you think about it, the law is the threshold for what people could do before the government's allowed to take their rights away. For example, the speed limit. There's a sign on this road right outside where I'm at right now that says 45 mile an hour. That's how fast you're allowed to go. That's the threshold. If you go over 45 mile an hour, the government has said that is a safety concern to the rest of the people in the community. Therefore, they can take your rights away by fining you and taking some of your property away, or by imprisoning you if it's so egregious, in order to ensure the safety for everyone else. That's what a speed limit is. If we don't have to have the government tell us the threshold for when they're allowed to take away your rights, that would be like saying we don't have to post what the speed limit is. And so you're driving, you're going 45 mile an hour. The police pulls you over and goes, you went beyond the threshold of the speed that's safe, so I'm fining you. And you would say, okay, well, what is the safe speed? What's the threshold? And the cop says, well, you went beyond it. And you're like, yeah, but what's the number? No, I'm not going to tell you the number. I'm just going to say you went beyond it. Well, then maybe next week you're driving down the same road and you say, okay, I'm only going to go 30 mile an hour. And the cop pulls you over and goes, you went beyond the threshold for safe speed. I'm giving you another fine. And you're like, how can that be? I'm going 15 mile an hour slower than I was last week. Well, you're still beyond the threshold. But what's the threshold? Is it 30 mile an hour? I'm not going to tell you that. I'm just saying you went beyond the threshold. And we leave it completely up to the police officer and the government to decide when you've passed that threshold. Is that a society you want to live in? Because that's what these people are suggesting. I'm not going to demand the government tells me their threshold. In fact, it's immoral of you to ask what that threshold is. All we need to know is this time it's past the threshold. Well, what is the threshold? Were we worried that 100 million people or 100,000 people could die? Were we worried that 1 million people could die? What were the chances of that happen? No. We can't ask those questions. Can't ask. We just have to accept the government was right. This time it was really bad, so we have to accept it. And the reason is because if they gave you those numbers, if they said, like Dr. Ferguson said, 2.2 million people could die, and we think if we institute these plans, we could save 80% of people, but then in reality only 10,000 people die, you would say, whoa, even under your best estimation, you could have only solved 80% of these deaths. Yet the amount of people that died was far less than 80% less of your original prediction of 2.2 million. So you were wrong. You were wrong about your initial prediction. And you said that was the threshold. Therefore, you took away our rights and collapsed the economy under false pretenses. That's why no one wants to give you the answers. That's why the government won't give you the answers to these questions. That's why your friends or your people you're associating with on chat boards or online or on YouTube or on Twitter, that's why they won't give you the number. They won't tell you what their threshold is. Because they know that could lead to them being proven wrong. And more than people dying, Right now, what these people are most concerned with is, I can't be proven wrong. I don't want to be the person that cheered for government tyranny and for the collapse of the economy, and it turned out it was all unwarranted. So no matter what, I'll say, yes, whatever the final results is, the government did the right thing. Even if we take away selfish motivations out of this, and we just are saying, hey, we trust the government was doing everything in our best interest and blah, blah, blah. How can we ever hold our government accountable, not in a neglectful or a criminal or immoral stance, but just to hold our government accountable in a making sure they're doing the best possible job stance? How can we make sure they're doing the best possible job if they set the conditions to show whatever the end result is, they did perfect? I talk about this all the time. I call it Schrodinger's Patriot Act, right? Let's go back to the Patriot Act. We passed the Patriot Act because we need to protect ourselves from terrorism. So let's say hypothetically, after passing the Patriot Act, 10 years later, not one terrorist attack on U.S. soil. Do you think the government's going to say, well, apparently we didn't need the Patriot Act because there were no terrorist acts, so we were wrong to take away your rights for no reason? No, of course not. They're going to say, yes, the fact we took away your rights prevented terrorism. Now, let's go back and say they passed the Patriot Act, and hypothetically, the amount of terror attacks on U.S. soils triple. Does that mean I'll say, see, that proves that taking away my rights wasn't warranted? The attacks came anyways. They'd say, no, of course not. The fact there were so many attacks proves that we were right to take away your rights, and we should have done more. That's exactly the condition they're setting up here. If this ends up killing 10,000 people in the United States, they'll say, see, we saved you. We're heroes. And people will say, yay, the media was right. Yay, the government was right. Thank goodness they spent $6 trillion and collapsed the economy and took away people's rights and took away people's livelihood. They were right. Only 10,000 people died. So the next time that something comes up and the government says, hey, remember, we were right last time. Remember how we saved all your lives last time? So you got to give us another $6 trillion. You got to suspend small businesses again. And thus, we get the establishment dream of collapsing the middle class, which is exactly what they're trying to do, to usher in globalism. It is literally the end of the country. This disease wouldn't wipe out the country. This sort of behavior of being willing to give up our rights and have massive wealth redistribution that will collapse the middle class anytime the government says, be afraid, we're doomed. I was on Sarah Corrier's show the other night and I said this. I said, imagine that we die. Imagine I myself die, and I end up in heaven and there's the founding fathers. And there's Ben Franklin doing a keg stand out of one of those old-timey casks. And they all got mugs and we're drinking and we're having a great time. And they're like, Rob, hey man, you got to live in that country that we fought so hard for. What was it like? And I was like, yeah, it was the greatest country in the history of the world. You guys are the best. Thanks. And they're like, yeah, we heard a rumor that the United States collapsed. What was it? Were there aliens? Did a massive natural disaster? Did an asteroid hit? Were we invaded by another world superpower? And I'm like, no, we panic bought a lot of toilet paper because we were worried about a flu-like virus. And that was the end of our country. How shameful is that? Greatest country in the history of the world brought down by people unwilling to question their government when the government's fear-mongering them. Is that what we're going to do? Easy, Courtney. Heaven. That's what's happening. Now, I'm going to show one other article here, and it's from the press conference yesterday. Now remember, you constantly hear, oh, but look at the deaths in Italy. There's hospitals running out of ventilators right now. They're at capacity right now. How is that true? There are rumors going around that many hospitals in this country are issuing do not resuscitate orders. In other words, if someone looks like they're passing away of the coronavirus, just leave them die. That's how bad things are getting. 700 people dead in the country from this disease, and that's how bad things are getting? The CDC says 50,000 this year have died of the flu. Where were the do not resuscitate orders there? We keep hearing that hospitals are at capacity. I talked to Todd Bartley. He said, according to him, the amount of ICU beds in the state of Pennsylvania that are being used right now. Are you ready for this? This is according to Governor Tom Wolf's own numbers. 1/1000th. That's how many are being taken up by coronavirus victims. 1 out of every 1,000. That means we have 999 per corona case victims beds left to go. So, I want to read to you from the transcript from Dr. Birx. Or is it Birx? I can't remember. Yesterday. Birx, I believe. And what she says about this fear-mongering. This is Trump's own advisor. Now, people will say, see, Trump's doing a good job. No! Trump's endorsing these lockdowns. Trump's signing off on the $6 trillion. This is what I'm talking about. We're getting these mixed messages from everywhere. From our governors, from the media, from the president, from his task force. On one hand, they're telling us, no big deal, don't worry about it. On the other hand, they're saying, but we have to spend $6 trillion and lock down the country. Which is it? Dr. Birx, coronavirus data doesn't match the doomsday media predictions. This is March 26, 2020. This is from her press conference, the big press conference yesterday. You ready? White House Coronavirus Task Force member Dr. Deborah Birx warned the public not to panic when they hear about models and projections of the pandemic spread. Models are models, she said. When people start talking about 20% of the population getting infected, it's very scary, but we don't have data that matches that based on our current experience. She said the media should not make the implication that when they need a hospital bed, it's not going to be there, or a ventilator, it's not going to be there. We have no evidence of that. It's our job to collectively assure the American people, she said. There's no model right now, no reality on the ground where we can see that 60 to 70% of Americans are going to get infected in the next 8 to 12 weeks. I want to be clear. Here's her actual quotes. You ready? We'll go through the whole thing. I'm sure you've seen the recent report out of the UK about them adjusting completely their needs. This is really quite important. If you remember, that was the report that says there would be 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million deaths in the United States. They've adjusted that number in the UK to 20,000. 500,000 to 20,000. We are looking at that in great detail to understand this adjustment. I'm going to say something that's a little bit complicated, but do it in a way we can understand it together. In the model, either you have a large group of people who asymptomatic, who never presented for any test of any kind to have the numbers predicted. To get to 60 million people infected, you have to have a large group of asymptomatics. Now let me stop here. Do you understand what she's saying? For this number of 500,000 people, or 2.2 million, 500,000 dead in the UK, or 2.2 million in the US, to be accurate, you would need to say the infection is spread so far so already. That number would be about 60 million. But in order for that to be true, there have to be a lot of people that are asymptomatic or don't have terrible symptoms. But if that number is true, and there are 60 million people currently infected, but only 700 have died, that proves the mortality rate is far lower than the projections we're given. Or it turns out that it's not as infectious as we thought, if the mortality rate's correct. But you can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, millions of people are affected or infected that we didn't know about, but the mortality rate's like 1.27%. It doesn't work that way. If a bunch of people are infected we don't know about, that means they're not dying from the disease, which means it directly, by that same magnitude, brings down the mortality of the disease. So think about it this way. If 10 times more people are infected than we currently think, because so many people aren't exhibiting symptoms, that means the mortality rate is directly 10 times less lethal. That number is directly proportional. What they want to do is, on one hand, they say, oh, just look at the mortality rate. The mortality rate is what it is. It's 1.3%, or whatever they're saying. And so, we predict that 60 million people will be infected, and therefore that means 1.2 million people will die. But then you're like, well, wait a minute. If that many people are infected, wouldn't that mean the mortality rate's way lower than's anticipated? So they are taking the highest estimate of the mortality and the highest rate of the infected, but they're not putting them together proportionally. Let's get back to what she says. Quote, we have not seen an attack rate of over 1 in 1,000. So either we are measuring the iceberg and underneath it are a large group of people. So we are working hard to get... Do you see what she's saying? So what they mean about an iceberg is what we can see is the people that have been tested and we know are infected. We're measuring that for things like mortality rate. But in reality, there's this huge group of people below the water, the iceberg below the water, that we just have no clue that we're infected. Or it turns out that that death rate's not as bad as we thought in the first, or not as many people are as infected as we thought in the first place. Quote, so we are working hard to get the antibody test to figure out who these people are and do they exist. Or we have a transmission completely wrong. So either they were wrong about how infectious this thing is, or they were right about how infectious it is, but they were wrong about the mortality rate. But the numbers of dead prove that they couldn't be right about the infectious rate and the mortality rate. And come to these sorts of predictions. It's just not adding up, is what she's saying. Continuing. So these are the things we're looking at because the predictions of the model don't match the reality on the ground in China, South Korea, or Italy. We are 5 times the size of Italy. If we were Italy and did all those divisions, Italy should have close to 400,000 deaths. They are not close to achieving that. So in other words, if these models are correct and how infectious the disease is and what the mortality rate is, we would currently be seeing 400,000 deaths in Italy. Instead, we have 8,000. She goes on, models are models. There is enough data of the real experience with coronavirus on the ground to really make these predictions much more sound. So when people start talking about 20% of the population getting infected, it's very scary. But we don't have data that matches that based on our experience. In other words, it's garbage. We don't see the data that backs up this 20% number. Now, I've argued with people on places like Above Top Secret that told me they were convinced that at least 60,000 people would be infected. Now their prediction jumped up to 160,000 will be infected. Based on what numbers? Based on the guy that said 2.2 million would die and now's revised his prediction in the UK to 25 times less than what he initially predicted? Continuing, and to the situation about ventilators. We are reassured in meeting with our colleagues in New York that there are still ICU beds remaining and still significant. Over 1,000 or 2,000 ventilators that have not been used. How can that be true? Everyone that I talk to about this that says I'm a fool for questioning it says, they're out of ICU beds. It's a catastrophe. They don't have ventilators for people. Well, according to the actual government, they're saying that's not true. There's still ICU beds. We still have 1,000 to 2,000 more ventilators than they need. Continuing, please, for the reassurance of people around the world, to wake up this morning and look at people talking about the creating DNR situations. Do not resuscitate situations for patients. There is no situation in the United States right now that warrants that kind of discussion. You could be thinking about it in the hospital. Certainly, hospitals talk about this on a daily basis. But to say that the American people and make the implication that when they need a hospital bed, it's not going to be there, or a ventilator, it's not going to be there. We have no evidence of that. It's our job to collectively assure the American people. It's our job to make sure it doesn't happen. You can see the cases are concentrated in highly urban areas, and there are other parts of the states that have lots of ventilators and other parts of New York State that don't have any infected. We can meet the needs by being responsive. There is no model right now, no reality on the ground, where I can see that 60 to 70% of Americans are going to be infected in the next 8 to 12 weeks. I want to be clear about that. We are adapting to the reality on the ground and looking at the models of how they can inform, but learning from South Korea, Italy, and from Spain, and I know you will look up my numbers. That's one of the 2 doctors that are heading this task force. They don't see any evidence that 20% are going to be infected. The models are incredibly inaccurate if they're looking at both the mortality rate and the infectious rate being the numbers that were predicted. If those numbers were accurate, we would currently be seeing 400,000 deaths in Italy. Instead, we see like 8,000. Now, this is all boring. Who gives a rat's behind about these numbers? And I know people say, Rob, calm down. Why are you so upset? The reason to be angry is now. If you're willing to give up your rights and say, we'll question it later, but this threat is so big, we have to give it up. For this, then you'll be willing to do it for anything. As technology advances, our governments or shady characters of any sort will be able to fake threatening situations more and more and more. We actually have deep fake technology right now where you could take someone and make it seem like a human being, a likeness that looks exactly like them and sounds exactly like them is saying whatever you want. Think of the possibilities that governments could use to strike fear into your heart, to strip you of your rights, and to take your wealth and property away. If this is all it takes. 2.2 million people die. We're all going to die. 2.2 million. That's insane. So we have to do whatever possible. Oh, turns out the people that were making those predictions have now adjusted their numbers to say it's actually 96% less lethal than what they originally predicted. Oh, well. And you're willing to just accept that? Oh, it's cool because Dr. Ferguson came out and said, oh, no, the social distancing will lower the deaths by 96%. That's garbage, and you know it. So, that's the numbers I wanted to give today. So when you go out there and people keep telling you that it's the end of the world and this and that and the other, remember, the guy that was predicting that is now saying, oh, instead of 500,000 people. What I meant to say is, this will basically be a regular flu season. $6 trillion spent in a regular flu season. Small businesses destroyed. Lives ruined. Over a flu season. Now look, maybe the numbers will get worse than that. But doesn't the mere fact that they're making these aren't slight adjustments. Off by a factor of 25, am I saying that right? You inflated the numbers 25 times higher than what you're now predicting? In the span of 3 days? But now we have to trust you now. No, I'm not buying it. Not at all. What's my prediction as a total layman? I think we'll probably see around 50 to 60,000 people die of this disease in the United States, which is tragic, and I feel bad for each and every one of them. But that's the flu. Yes, those numbers will probably be on top of the flu. So what? So is H1N1. We had a flu season then and H1N1. So is West Nile. So is SARS. So is tuberculosis. Are we going to shut the government down every time 50,000 extra people might die? How many people are going to die as a result of the depression we're going to face? The fact that we didn't demand that these questions be answered assured that we would be screwed over. That's what the government does. That's what the power hungry does. And what's amazing to me is so many people that said they're going to collapse the economy to take down Donald Trump. They want to erase the middle class in the United States. So many of those people are actually right now cheering to have policies to collapse the economy because this virus is so deadly. 3 weeks ago, they were telling you, oh, they're going to fake something to collapse the economy. Now they're saying, yes, please collapse the economy. That's how bad this virus is. The same people. And if those people that were the most skeptical of the media and the most skeptical of government are now willing to, without question, accept anything they say, without question, accept any infringement of rights and any wealth redistribution that they ask for, what chance do we have of stopping it the next time this comes around? Mark my words. Mark them now. Every argument that you hear Trump supporters or fiscal conservatives making right now as to why we don't have time to demand answers to these questions. We just have to give the government a blank check and accept whatever they do. These exact same arguments will be used as soon as there's a Democratic president say, we've declared a state of emergency over climate change. It's going to kill us all. We need to end the fossil fuel industry. I'll still be there fighting. But those of you that mocked me, those of you that said I wanted people to die because I was concerned about the economy and rights, you need to shut your mouth when that happens. You need to sit down with the rest of the bootlickers, okay? That's where you'll go. Shut your mouth because you've given up all personal integrity. You've given up your principles because you thought your side wouldn't lie to you. So you need to sit down and leave those of us who stuck it out, despite it being the unpopular opinion, and talked about how outrageous it was to allow the government to act this way without demanding answers to basic questions. We'll be the ones that will lead the charge there. You've sold out. So shut your mouth when it happens, when the Democrats do it. Okay, that'll probably be about all I do for videos today, unless something crazy happens. Maybe when my wife gets off work, I'll spend time with her. So, but yeah, I thank you all for watching. My wife's a jerk. But quarantined in my office, sir. At least that's a nice name to call me as opposed to what you normally call me. But now, so I thank you all for watching. Look, again, let me just make it real clear. I'm not saying the virus is a hoax. I'm not saying you shouldn't take personal protections against it. I'm not saying you're wrong to say I'm stocking up on guns or ammo or food or whatever. If you're buying crates upon crates of toilet paper, you're wrong. But other than that, yeah, you're right. You shouldn't trust the government for your safety. It's definitely a serious situation, but I think it's massively overblown. I had someone ask me, what if you're wrong? I'm not wrong. I can guarantee I'm not wrong. You want to know why? Because what was my claim? I admitted from the get-go. My gut feeling tells me this is way overblown, but I don't know. But this is what I'm saying. Despite the fact that I don't know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I don't know how infectious this will be, what the mortality rate will end up. I'm just sifting through the evidence, and it seems to have all the telltale signs of being overblown. But that's irrelevant, because I'm not saying that the government couldn't have taken these actions. What I am saying is we should demand that they have to answer those 4 basic questions. How many people could be infected or die? What is the likelihood of that happening? What is your threshold for taking these infringements on rights, this massive $6 trillion wealth redistribution? In other words, in the government's mind, before the virus, right? They have to be saying, for us to infringe on the guaranteed rights of people, for us to have massive emergency wealth redistribution, we need to get to a certain point. What was that point? And it's not, we need to wait until there's 50,000 dead before we act. It's, our models showed it was likely 50,000 dead, and then we could act. What is that threshold? And what is the percentage of the people that will be saved by your proposed solution? 4 simple questions. That's all I said. They could have answered them, just been honest about answering them, said, look, our model said 2.2 million people could possibly die. We don't know what the likelihood is. That's probably a small chance of that happening, but there's a decent chance that it'll be a number approaching that. So we thought our threshold was, if we're looking at potentially 1 million people possibly dying, that we need to act. And so we've decided to put a lot of parts of the country on lockdown. We've decided to shut down a lot of the economy. And our numbers show that this will be able to save up to 50 to 60% of the lives and really slow the spread of the disease. And so we feel that trade-off's worth it. Even if I didn't agree with them, and even if they ended up being wrong, I could say, hey, at least they made a good faith effort to explain to the American people exactly why they did this. And so when the next situation comes along, and it's the flu season next year, and a Democrat says, oh, okay, we also want to declare a state of emergency so that we could pass a $6 trillion bill and give a bunch of money to a bunch of projects that we want, we would be able to say, no, wait a minute. Last year, they had to answer all these questions. Let me see your models showing that 1 million people, because that's the threshold, 1 million people. Let me see your models suggesting 1 million people may die. Oh, you don't have those? Then no, we're unwilling to accept this emergency declaration. But instead, we just said, yeah, man, whatever you say, government, this is scary. And that's the greatest threat. I will, Courtney. I'll be done here in a second. So, and I know 100%, I know that I am right, that it is always better to have the government answer those questions than to allow them to strip our rights and have massive wealth redistribution without having to answer those basic questions. So if 2 million people end up dying and people say, haha, see, Rob, I told you so. Told me what? I said that maybe these actions were warranted. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm not a doctor. I'm saying the doctor should have explained the answers to these questions to us. Why am I wrong? There's no credible reason not to demand that. None. It would have taken too much time. Ridiculous. For them to even come up with a plan, they had to have the answers to this stuff privately. It would have caused panic. You don't think there's panic now? When Dr. Ferguson's saying, do what we say or 2.2 million people will die? You don't think that's panic? You don't think the media is causing panic right now? In fact, there'd be less panic if the actual government gave the actual numbers they were looking at, no matter how high they are. There's no reason not to have given the answers to those. And then you hear other things. The DOJ possibly asking for the suspension of habeas corpus, bailing out large billionaire businesses. What does that have anything to do with this? The emergency bill should have been about saving people from the virus and making sure people had enough money or a situation to pay the bills and to eat and have a livelihood until they could get back to work. That's it. You want to talk about bailing out Carnival Cruise Lines or the airlines? We can do that after the emergencies ended. Their stocks are not an emergency right now. People not being able to pay the bills are. You want to talk about diversity like the Pelosi bill or bailing out the Kennedy Arts Center? We can talk about that crap later. That's not what the emergency is. And the fact that they're talking with all that other stuff, and the fact that we see doctors like Dr. Ferguson revising his numbers in such extreme ways, leads you to believe they're not taking this as serious as they're telling you to take it. If they were, they wouldn't be talking about the Kennedy Arts Center. So, all right, everyone, I'm going to be heading out. Thank you all for joining me. As always, I appreciate each and every one of you. You guys are the best. You really are. Except my wife. She's okay. I wouldn't say the best. No, I'm just kidding. You're the best too, Courtney. You're the best of the best, Courtney. So, I'm going to go tonight. You probably won't see me doing much. Thank you to the people that have been emailing me and stuff. Listen, I'm not going to, my mental health's fine. I'm not, on the verge of a breakdown or anything like that. But quite the opposite. Because of the shutdown and we don't know what we're doing with our economics, I'm having family members with health issues unrelated to the coronavirus and things like that. Sometimes I just need to relax, not think about these difficult questions. So Thursdays, Fridays and Saturdays are normally my days to do that because I actually get to spend time with my wife. So, there's a chance I won't be doing much more on this today. But you never know. I might impromptu do something. So YouTube won't inform you. So good luck. But thank you all. I really appreciate all you listening to me, even if you disagree. As always, I'm just asking you, ask questions. Don't have blind faith in anyone, including me. Always demand answers to questions. That's it. So thank you all so much. Stay safe out there. And as always, have a good one.